So shifting gears, kind of looking back, what was your relationship to the oso-landslide?
Well, I mean, I was one of the first people on it, and it was my story for months. I was one of the first people in the pool to go in there, and it was brutal. But because I had done a lot on earthquakes and geology, and I've got a background in that area, then I tended to focus on the science. What happened, why it happened, and what was this going to lead to in terms of preventing this from happening again, or at least getting people out of the way for the next time.
In the first couple days, even weeks, did they understand the full extent of what, scientifically speaking, had happened here?
No. We had one advantage in the sense that, and I'm sure you're going to explain what LIDAR is, or I can explain what LIDAR is, but they had done a series of LIDAR flights over this valley not more than, I think, a few months before the landslide. And if you don't know what LIDAR is, think of it like light radar. And an airplane flies over and it sets up just trillions of little laser spots that measure the ground. Measures the trees, measures the leaves too, but you can basically filter out all the vegetation and you can get a realistic picture of what the actual earth looks like, what the dirt, what the rocks, what the rivers, all of that look like. And they had done that. So one of the things that they knew fairly early was just how much material had been lost out of this hillside, because they could see what it looked like after the slide and they could see what it looked like before the slide.
When did you start hearing or learning or break that piece of the story about how fast that debris, avalanche and debris flow?
So it was, I don't remember exactly, but it was a few weeks later, and I had been doing a lot on volcanoes with the U.S. Geological Survey Volcano Observatory down in Vancouver, Washington. And part of volcano research is looking at the movement of Earth. So if you look at Mount St. Helens and you look at the buildup over several months that actually led to the eruption, you can see things shift. The bulge on the north side of the mountain. And then when the mountain collapses, you can just see how all that dirt and rock and everything, that gigantic landslide moves out. So that was an important area of research for them, which meant that they had the tools in place to measure this. And I'd been in contact with them, and they said, there's something you want to see. And they had an animation of the slide, which is in some of those stories that hopefully you've seen. You see that big blue area that comes out. And they estimated the speed of all of that mud, because it was so saturated, that zoomed across the valley between about 60 and 70 miles per hour. And they described it as like an entire row of semis that would have been traveling at that kind of speed, mowing over everything in its path, which is what happened. And I think there's a sound bite in there, but one of the victims who survived, a mother with a baby at the time, said it was like a movie. You could see this coming at you, and the houses would just explode and explode and explode until it finally got to her.
In those, weeks and months that followed, obviously, well, the first few weeks, it was just the rescue and then the recovery and those kinds of things.
Right.
But scientifically speaking, what kind of questions were they trying to answer from there? What did they want to understand about what had happened here?
Well, I mean, there's multiple layers to the story. One was the recovery and the recovery of the victims. And the whole scene was like an airplane crash. I mean, it was on that kind of a scale. I mean, at one point I was thinking about this morning, because when we would attend all these press conferences, initially they thought maybe 170 people or more had been lost. The final result was 43, which still makes it the most deadly landslide in U.S. history. That's still a lot of people. And when you're in there, it's like being in a plane crash. I mean, there's bits of houses and people's possessions and cars and vehicles and kids' toys and everything else. And that's the stuff that wasn't buried. And under all of that, they're trying to find all 43 people. And the reason the number was so high to begin with is that, people are calling, one person might be somebody's son or daughter or friend or grandchild or parent. And so various people are calling in. I haven't seen my Uncle Charlie in 3 days. I think he may be in there. But once they paired it, once they sort of screened through all of that, they came to the final number. But that's still a big number, 43. And they found everybody.
You talked a little bit about LiDAR. Do you mind, and I had David explain to us what it is too, but he kind of had his own way to it, just explaining how this has been used since then in landslide research.
So we all know Washington is a very steep state. So we have a lot of dirt that is piled up. We have a lot of rocks. We have volcanoes. We have mountains. We have everything else. And it's not all the same. It's different types of soil. And the state developed an initiative to fly LiDAR over the entire state that was considered potentially vulnerable to landslides because they wanted an inventory. They wanted what they did have here in terms of a background, sort of the background level of what is going on. In everywhere you go where there are landslides, there are going to be evidence of previous landslides, and that is certainly true up this valley. And you look at the kind of circular cutout that is there that resulted in this landslide. Then you back off from that, you go wider, and you see that same pattern repeating itself up and down this valley. And there's a certain type of geological leftovers from the Ice Age that created the kinds of soils that were there here. They're not necessarily the same as the next valley over. So you have this variety of rock and debris. And, I'm not a scientist, but that's one of the big takeaways of it. And this was like 600 feet high and then just calved off. It was saturated and just flowed out and then went up the other side. So one of the stories that we did was we were with, I think it was the county at that point, and they had an observation post, and we were up on the other side, and there was mud in the trees above where we were standing.
And that was because that piece of land fell, and then the puddle of
So
mud back up.
it fell. I mean, it was rotational, and it comes down, goes across, and up. And that was the speed, and that just testified to the degree of saturation. It testified to the weight. It testified to just the incredible volume of material that came out. It wasn't the biggest landslide in U.S. history in terms of cubic yards, but it was the most fatal.
What did you learn about why that was? Was it the speed of the debris, just the amount?
Well, we had been in there in 2006 where part of that wall had calved off and blocked the river and pushed the river through that Steelhead Haven neighborhood. And then 8 years later, some of the people we had met before were gone.
In the aftermath of this, what kind of urgency did you see? I mean, there was a ton of other mapping done, and they'd been doing mapping,
Right.
and they did more, and we know where landslides are. But do we necessarily have a full understanding of the impact that they can have, of those run-out zones?
Well, we do now. And the whole idea here is when we're looking at land use planning, which became an issue, in the aftermath of this. That's a critical factor. I mean, Snohomish County is huge. Snohomish County is vulnerable on several different levels. Landslides part of it. That not just there. One of the volcanoes that people normally see, which is Glacier Peak, is a cause for concern for eruption by the Cascades Volcano Observatory. That is in Snohomish County, eastern Snohomish County. And it is being studied, but they want to have more warning systems. That's another story I was involved with quite a bit when I was working. So the bottom line here is we need to be able to figure that out. And then there's the earthquake connection. Because one of the things that earthquakes do is trigger landslides. So if you have an area, and in Nisqually we had that, down going Maple Valley, and I'll rephrase that because I think it's important. Okay. So the Nisqually earthquake of 2001, we had landslides. Some of those were in Maple Valley. And I know there was one house, we interviewed the people who owned that house, and another rotational slide, so it kind of comes down and lifts up and pushed the house up and destroyed it. So anywhere around the state, they want to know what that is. And in eastern Washington, south of Yakima, not too many years after Oso, there was another area where they were starting to see cracks and things like that. And that moved to a point and stopped. So there was no disaster there, but they were worried about what that could lead to. So we're not in Kansas. It's not flat land. And it moves. And the basics of geology are erosion, which I would consider this erosion. And, but it's erosion in a violent way, because over millions of years, you would have rains, you would have, gravity doesn't go away, the rule of gravity is never canceled, and you had repeated examples of that, and not just here. When you see something like that, 10 years later, it sticks with me. It was a very emotional thing to go through. In fact, there was a gentleman who was a minister. I don't remember exactly what he was, but he was there as kind of an emotional support person for the reporters. It was horrible. It was a horrible thing to see. And 10 years later, it's still there. And when I talk about it, it comes back. You know, I wasn't a victim, but when you're there and you are, you know, we were, you know, like I said, I was one of the first pool people in. Not the first, but one of the early ones. And one of the agreements that we struck with the authorities was when they located a body, that all the filming would stop. There would be a whistle, a horn that went off. And that happened when we were back in there. And these people didn't have a chance. Everything was wrecked. Everything was wet. They didn't know, I mean, there was a risk of contamination. When we went through, there was still water running along the road. And we had to be decontaminated when we were coming out of there.
Was that for the bacteria in the water?
Bacteria.
Anything, just anything.
I mean, you had...
Yeah. Sewage?
You had
Probably,
sewage,
yeah. Yeah, that's true.
You had decomposition. You had all sorts of stuff. And of course, everybody who was back in there had to go through the same thing. And it's just, it was an overwhelming scene. And you don't, I mean, part of the thing about this job was it's one thing to see something on TV, and it's another thing to be working in these kinds of environments. And this one was difficult. And it was just, and it was, I mean, I don't know how many times I was in there. And then things loosened up. So, and then at one point we actually went in there with the USGS team as they were doing, this is another story that we did, where they were doing samplings of the soil. And so we were not right up against the wall. I mean, this was months later when things had stabilized. They didn't know if more wasn't going to come down. And they had gone up there, not without some risk, placing these targets, call them targets, they're basically reflectors, along the outside of where things had sheared off. And when I was talking about that story I did with the county, we were up on the other side, and they had observers on there 24/7 looking to see if any of that thing moved, because they didn't know if this thing was done or not. And Obviously, it's a memorial now and should be. It was surreal. I mean, we're in a convoy going in. I can't remember who all was in there. I mean, we had the National Guard, we had the Sheriff's Department, we had FEMA, just every agency you can think of. And when it was our time to go in, we're driving in there, and I think you kind of came around. I can't remember. We came around a turn and over a hill, and then there it is. And then you're getting cleared in, and then you see the water, you see the mud. We'd already seen aerials of what it looked like in terms of where it sheared off and looking down on it, but then we're in it. And then we would go actually up on the right side, on the south side of the valley, and look down into things. And then we did several, I can't remember, it was a week or more later, then we went in on the ground with FEMA. So we were actually down in that community, and we were as close to that debris walking on the mud as I am to you right now.
You had mentioned that it's important that we understand our geology in our state. Anything else that you wanted to touch on that? Anything else that we need to emphasize to folks?
Well, I mean, we've been, when I was with King, we talked a lot about earthquakes and we talked a lot about preparation. And this is a little bit of a different cat. Mm-hmm. The two are not separate. They're not exclusive from each other because, like I said, earthquakes can trigger landslides. And I'd seen other slides in this state, nothing on this scale before, but I had seen other slides. And we had one that was at a quarry area near it was near Natchez. Mm. And and I don't remember what triggered it anymore, but that was another rotational slide that took all these houses and just lifted them up and destroyed the road going through there. I think that was Highway 410. And there will be more, So land use planning is an area where a lot of this is being applied. Where should we allow neighborhoods to be built? What's the geology around there? All of that stuff can be affected by what they've learned. But they needed to identify where the greatest hazards are. And I don't know if you've talked to DNR or not, the Washington Geological Survey, but they're the authorities on this. And this was their initiative to get that done. And it had already started even before the oso-slide because there was a greater recognition of the risk. And I think a lot of that was driven by the greater recognition of an earthquake risk. Mm-hmm. And so the two often go together.